The bitter December rain lashed against Maggie's threadbare jacket as she hurried from her double shift at Bayou Diner, the meager tips barely enough for this month's tuition payment. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, an unknown number that she almost ignored until something made her pause beneath the flickering streetlight on Canal Street. "Hello?" she answered, hearing nothing but shallow breathing and the unmistakable sound of teeth chattering. "Is someone there?" Maggie pressed, clutching the phone tighter as the rain soaked through to her skin, the eerie silence on the other end sending chills down her spine. Finally, a small voice whispered, "Help," before breaking into silent sobs that tore at Maggie's heart. The background noise of traffic and pouring rain, making it clear the caller was outdoors somewhere in the unforgiving New Orleans winter night. "Where are you, honey?" Maggie asked, already changing direction, her own problems momentarily forgotten as maternal instinct kicked in. "Can you tell me what you see around you?" The voice, clearly a child's, managed to stammer out that she was at Lafayette Square, sitting on a bench near some big white building, the words barely coherent through violent shivering. Maggie broke into a run, her worn sneakers splashing through puddles as she headed toward the historic district. She found the girl huddled under a magnolia tree, soaked to the bone in what had once been an expensive school uniform, now plastered to her thin frame like a second skin. Long, dark hair hung in wet ropes around a face too pale and eyes too haunted for someone so young. "I'm Maggie," she said softly, approaching slowly with hands visible, the way you might approach a wounded animal. "I got your call, and I'm here to help you, okay?" The girl nodded, but didn't speak, her lips tinged blue as she clutched a small pink phone with a cracked screen. When Maggie draped her own jacket around the trembling shoulders, the child didn't resist. "Can you tell me your name?" Maggie asked, rubbing the girl's arms gently to restore circulation. "Is there someone I can call for you?" The girl's eyes, deep brown and filled with a mixture of fear and relief, met Maggie's briefly, before flicking down to her phone. "My dad," she whispered, fingers fumbling with the device before holding it out with a specific contact highlighted. "Dad." Maggie hesitated only a second before hitting dial, expecting a frantic parent, perhaps a messy divorce situation. What she got instead was a deep, commanding voice that answered with two chilling words. "Who's dead?" "No one's dead," Maggie responded quickly, her free arm still around the shivering girl. "But I think I found your daughter in Lafayette Square. She's cold, wet, and can barely speak." The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds, but felt like an eternity before the man spoke again. His tone shifted from threatening to something equally intense but different. "Put her on," he demanded, the sound of movement and barked orders in the background suggesting immediate mobilization. "She's not really able to talk right now," Maggie explained, noting how the girl curled tighter into her side. "She needs dry clothes and probably medical attention. Her lips are blue." A string of muffled curses followed before the voice returned, now controlled but edged with steel. "Don't move from that spot," he commanded, no room for argument in his tone. "I'll be there in 8 minutes." True to his word, exactly 8 minutes later, 3 black SUVs with tinted windows screeched to a halt along the park perimeter. The center vehicle disgorged a tall man in an expensive suit who moved with predatory grace despite the downpour, flanked by 2 obvious security personnel scanning the area with practiced efficiency. The moment the girl spotted him, she tried to stand but swayed dangerously, prompting Maggie to steady her, as the man closed the distance between them with long strides. "Penny," he breathed, the single word carrying unmistakable relief as he dropped to one knee before the child. Maggie stood awkwardly to the side as the man, who introduced himself curtly as August Carter, wrapped his daughter in his suit jacket and lifted her into his arms. The tenderness of the gesture contrasted sharply with the cold calculation in his eyes when they finally settled on Maggie. "You called instead of the police," he stated, not a question but an assessment, his gaze moving from her waitress uniform to her worn shoes. "Why?" Before Maggie could answer, one of his men approached, leaning in to whisper something that made Carter's expression harden momentarily before he gave a short nod. "Check the perimeter again," he ordered, shifting Penny in his arms as she burrowed against his chest. "She asked me to call you, not the police," Maggie said simply, gathering her soaked jacket from where it had fallen. "I should go. I have an early class tomorrow." Something flickered in Carter's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation. "You're a student?" he asked, his tone suggesting the information was being filed away rather than asked out of casual interest. "Nursing, at Tulane," Maggie replied, taking a step backward, suddenly aware of how the security men had formed a loose perimeter around them. Is Penny going to be okay? The question seemed to catch Carter off guard, his attention shifting back to his daughter, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep against his shoulder. Thanks to you, he said after a moment, his voice carrying a new note of thoughtful consideration. My driver will take you home, he stated, the words clearly not an offer but a command. Samuel will get your information. I'd like to properly thank you for helping my daughter. Maggie opened her mouth to decline, but was already being ushered toward the second SUV by a man whose polite smile did nothing to mask the authority in his guidance. Mr. Carter insists, he said quietly, opening the vehicle's door to reveal an interior that probably cost more than her entire apartment building. The luxury of the vehicle's leather seats made Maggie acutely aware of her soaked clothing and bedraggled appearance as she reluctantly gave her address to the driver. Through the tinted window, she could see Carter carrying Penny to the lead vehicle, his protective stance at odds with the cold efficiency of the men around him. Mr. Carter owned several import businesses in the port, the driver offered unprompted as they pulled away, his eyes meeting hers briefly in the rearview mirror. He's a very influential man in New Orleans. Maggie recognized the careful phrasing for what it was, a warning wrapped in information, delivered with just enough emphasis to make her stomach tighten with sudden understanding. Import businesses, she repeated flatly, thinking of the security detail and Carter's first words on the phone. Who's dead? The next morning, Maggie had almost convinced herself the entire encounter had been a strange dream, until she exited her apartment building to find one of Carter's men leaning against a black sedan parked directly outside. Miss Bennett, he greeted her with formal politeness. Mr. Carter would like a word. The drive to the Garden District took less than 20 minutes, but represented a journey between worlds, from Maggie's crumbling apartment complex to tree-lined streets where antebellum mansions stood in stately grandeur behind wrought iron gates. The Carter residence occupied a corner lot, its Greek Revival columns and sweeping verandas speaking of old money and power. He's waiting in the study, announced the housekeeper who answered the door, her crisp uniform and neutral expression suggesting professional discretion was a job requirement. This way, please. August Carter stood as Maggie entered the book-lined study, his tailored suit and commanding presence making the spacious room seem somehow smaller. Miss Bennett, he greeted, gesturing to a leather chair across from his desk. Thank you for coming. I didn't realize I had a choice, Maggie replied with more boldness than she felt, taking the offered seat while noting the family photograph on his desk. Penny, perhaps 2 years younger, smiling between Carter and a beautiful woman with the same dark eyes. How is your daughter? A flash of something, concern, perhaps, or frustration, crossed Carter's face before his expression settled back into careful neutrality. Physically, she's recovering from mild hypothermia and exhaustion, he said, his fingers drumming once on the polished desktop before going still. But, Maggie prompted, nursing instinct overriding her intimidation as she leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on Carter's. There's more to it than that, isn't there? Carter studied her for a long moment before standing to pour 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. Penny hasn't spoken a word since her mother's car accident 3 months ago, he stated, placing 1 glass before Maggie without asking if she wanted it. Until last night, when she called you, he continued, returning to his seat with calculated grace. My daughter found your number on a receipt from your diner. Apparently you served them lunch last week. Maggie's mind flashed to the memory. A quiet girl with watchful eyes sitting across from a woman who could have been the one in the photograph, though she'd been too busy with the lunch rush to notice much else. I'm sorry about your wife, she offered quietly, leaving the drink untouched. Ex-wife, Carter corrected without emotion, though his knuckles whitened slightly around his glass. The accident occurred after our divorce was finalized. Penny was supposed to be with her that weekend but got sick and stayed home. The implication hung in the air between them, heavy and unspoken. Survivor's guilt wrapped in a child's trauma, complicated by the fractures of a broken family. Maggie's heart ached for the girl, even as her common sense warned her that she was wading into dangerous waters. Mr. Carter, I'm not sure why I'm here, Maggie said finally, fighting the urge to shift under his assessing gaze. I'm glad Penny is okay, but I want to hire you, he interrupted, setting down his glass with a decisive click against the desktop. Penny responded to you when she hasn't responded to anyone else in months. Not me, not her therapists, not her teachers. Maggie blinked, momentarily speechless as Carter continued, his tone shifting to that of a businessman presenting terms. You're studying nursing, which gives you medical knowledge, and you clearly have a natural way with children in distress. I already have 2 jobs to pay for school, Maggie protested, though even as she spoke, she calculated the hours she worked against her mounting student loans and upcoming rent increase. I don't have time to... Carter slid a folded piece of paper across the desk, cutting off her objection with brutal efficiency. That's what I'm prepared to offer as a monthly salary if you move into the East Wing and focus exclusively on helping Penny readjust. When Maggie unfolded the paper, the figure written there made her inhale sharply. It was more than she'd make in 6 months at the diner, possibly enough to complete her degree without crushing debt. This is excessive, she managed, looking up to find Carter watching her reaction with clinical interest. My daughter's well-being isn't a matter where I concern myself with appropriate budget constraints, Miss Bennett, he replied, the steel back in his voice. The question is whether you're willing to help her. 3 weeks into her new position, Maggie had established a routine with Penny that was showing promising results, though promising in this context meant occasional nods, rare eye contact, and exactly 17 spoken words, which Maggie diligently logged in the journal she kept. The east wing of the Carter mansion was a world unto itself, with its own kitchen, sitting room, and a small courtyard garden where Maggie often took Penny to read, or simply sit in contemplative silence. It felt separate from the main house where August conducted his business, a buffer zone of safety that Maggie maintained with quiet determination. This morning, however, the buffer was breached when Maggie rounded a corner with a breakfast tray to find 2 unfamiliar men exiting August's study, their hushed conversation cutting off abruptly at the sight of her. The taller man's hand twitched subtly toward his jacket before August appeared in the doorway behind them. Miss Bennett, August said smoothly, his eyes communicating a clear message to retreat. Is everything all right with Penny this morning? Before Maggie could answer, the shorter of the 2 men spoke, his New York accent thick with barely concealed disdain. This the nanny you mentioned, Carter? He asked, gaze sweeping over Maggie in assessment that made her skin crawl. Caretaker, August corrected, a subtle shift in his posture placing him partially between Maggie and the visitors. Miss Bennett is helping my daughter through a difficult time. The taller man nodded, his expression neutral but eyes calculating. Admirable, he commented, though the word contained no actual admiration. Family is everything in our business, isn't it, Carter? That evening, after Penny had finally fallen asleep, Maggie found herself restlessly wandering the East Wing corridor when voices drifted up from the partially open study window below. She told herself to keep walking, but found her feet carrying her to the balcony where August's clipped tones floated clearly in the humid night air. The Mendoza territory isn't up for negotiation, Harrison, he was saying, his voice carrying the same steel edge Maggie had heard that first night. They've respected our boundaries for 3 generations. I'm not interested in being the first Carter to break that peace. A different voice, presumably Harrison, responded with barely controlled anger. The port expansion changes everything, August, and if you're too sentimental to see that, maybe your father stepped down too soon. Maggie pressed herself against the wall as silence stretched below, knowing instinctively that August's silence was more dangerous than any shouted threat could be. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to a register that raised goosebumps along her arms. Question my leadership again, and sentiment will be the least of your concerns, August stated, the quiet words carrying unmistakable finality. Now get out of my house before you wake my daughter. The following morning, Maggie was helping Penny button her cardigan when August appeared in the doorway, observing them with an unreadable expression. He was dressed more casually than usual in dark jeans and a simple button-down, the relaxed attire somehow making him seem more approachable, yet no less formidable. I thought we might all have breakfast on the veranda today, he suggested, directing the words to Penny, though his gaze briefly met Maggie's. The gardenias are in bloom. Penny looked up at Maggie, a silent question in her eyes that Maggie was beginning to recognize as a request for guidance. That sounds lovely, Maggie answered for both of them, noting how August's expression softened marginally when Penny nodded her agreement. The peaceful moment was shattered 20 minutes later when Samuel appeared with a tablet he urgently placed before August, murmuring something too low for Maggie to hear. August's face transformed instantly, all traces of the attentive father replaced by something cold and focused as he stood abruptly. Penny, stay with Maggie today. No garden visits, he instructed, his tone brooking no argument as he strode from the veranda without further explanation. Within minutes, the now familiar convoy of black vehicles had departed from the front drive, leaving behind a palpable tension that even Penny seemed to feel. That night, while Penny slept with the stuffed otter Maggie had given her clutched to her chest, news reports confirmed what Maggie had begun to suspect. A warehouse explosion in the lower 9th Ward, 3 casualties, authorities investigating possible criminal connections, while refusing to name specific organizations. The aftermath of what August referred to only as the warehouse incident lingered in the mansion like a storm cloud, with increased security personnel and hushed conversations that fell silent whenever Maggie appeared. Penny, always sensitive to atmosphere, retreated further into herself, refusing even the simple yes-no communication they'd established. On the 3rd night of this regression, frustrated and concerned, Maggie abandoned the careful schedule of activities she'd planned and instead led Penny to the mansion's solarium. "My mom used to say that plants are the best listeners," she explained, settling among the lush greenery with a blanket and 2 mugs of hot chocolate topped with tiny marshmallows. The room's glass ceiling revealed a canopy of stars, the humidity creating a cocoon of warmth around them as Maggie began speaking, not to Penny directly, but to a large peace lily beside them. "I'm worried about someone I care about," she confided to the plant, her voice gentle in the quiet space. "She's carrying something heavy inside, something she can't put into words yet, and I wish I knew how to help her feel safe enough to set it down," Maggie continued, studiously not looking at Penny, who had gone very still beside her, because sometimes the heaviest things get lighter when we share them. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the occasional distant sound of security patrols around the property's perimeter. Maggie had nearly given up when Penny's small voice emerged, barely audible even in the quiet room. "I saw them arguing," she whispered, eyes fixed on her marshmallows, which had melted into a creamy swirl. "Mom and Dad, the day before the accident." Maggie carefully maintained her position, not turning, not reacting beyond a gentle nod that encouraged continuation without pressure. Inside, her heart raced with the significance of this moment. Penny's first complete sentence in months, the first reference to her mother since Maggie's arrival. "She said she was taking me away, that Dad's business was too dangerous," Penny continued, her voice gaining the slightest strength. "I pretended to be asleep so they wouldn't stop fighting because of me." The confession hung between them, heavy with implication and a child's misplaced guilt, as Penny finally looked up at Maggie with eyes swimming in unshed tears. "I got sick the next day, so I couldn't go with her," she whispered, a single tear tracking down her cheek. "And then she was gone forever," Maggie finished softly, finally turning to face Penny directly. "And you've been wondering if things would be different if you hadn't gotten sick." Penny nodded, the movement releasing more tears that she made no attempt to hide. "Dad doesn't know I heard them," she confessed, her voice dropping even lower. "He doesn't know that I know what he really does." Maggie hesitated, knowing she was navigating dangerous waters, both emotionally for Penny and literally within the Carter household. "What do you think he really does?" she asked carefully, keeping her tone neutral. "He hurts people who don't follow his rules," Penny stated with the stark clarity that only children can manage. "That's why those men came to our house last week, because someone broke a rule about territories." The accuracy of Penny's assessment sent a chill down Maggie's spine, but she focused on the more immediate concern, the guilt and fear this knowledge was placing on small shoulders. "Penny, whatever your dad does, whatever happened with your mom, none of it is your fault." Penny's face crumpled, the dam finally breaking as weeks of silence gave way to body-racking sobs that Maggie absorbed wordlessly, holding the girl against her chest until the storm began to subside. "I miss her so much it hurts in my bones," Penny hiccuped against Maggie's shoulder. Neither of them noticed August standing frozen in the solarium doorway, his expression shifting through shock, grief, and something unnamed, before he silently withdrew without interrupting the breakthrough moment. The next morning, however, when Maggie went to prepare Penny's breakfast, she found August waiting in the kitchen, eyes shadowed from apparent sleeplessness. "She spoke to you," he stated, not a question but a recognition that carried equal parts gratitude and jealousy. "About her mother. She needs to process her grief without feeling it might hurt you," Maggie explained carefully, measuring coffee grounds with practiced precision to avoid meeting August's intense gaze. Children often protect their parents from their own emotions, especially after trauma. August absorbed this with a slight nod, watching as Maggie moved efficiently around the kitchen that had gradually become her domain. "And what about you, Maggie Bennett?" he asked, using her first name for the first time since her arrival. "Who protects you?" The question caught her off guard, forcing her to look up and meet eyes that had somehow shifted from clinical assessment to something more personal, more dangerous. "I've been taking care of myself since I was 15, she answered honestly, surprised by her own candor. "When your parents died in the flood," August stated, confirming Maggie's suspicion that he'd had her thoroughly investigated before offering her the position. "You stayed in the system just long enough to finish high school, then worked 3 jobs to put yourself through community college." Maggie set down the coffee pot with deliberate care, a flicker of anger warming her cheeks. "Is there anything about me you don't know, Mr. Carter?" she asked, unable to keep a sharp edge from her voice. "Quite a lot, I suspect," he replied, his expression softening fractionally as he pushed a manila folder across the counter toward her. "Including why someone with your resilience and intelligence is still working herself to exhaustion when other options were available." Inside the folder, Maggie found scholarship offers from 3 prestigious universities, all dated 4 years earlier, all addressed to her former foster home, all apparently intercepted before reaching her. "How did you get these?" she whispered, fingers tracing over opportunities long lost. "I have connections at Tulane," August replied, avoiding the actual question with practiced ease. "The same connections that assure me you could transfer your credits and enter their advanced nursing program next semester should you desire." The offer hung between them, ostensibly generous but laced with implication. August Carter didn't simply help people without gaining something in return. "And what would that cost me?" Maggie asked directly, meeting his gaze without flinching. Something like respect flickered in August's eyes before he answered. "Stay with Penny through the summer," he proposed, his tone businesslike, though his eyes remained intent on her face. "Help her heal. Help her speak to me again." Before Maggie could respond, Samuel appeared in the doorway, his usual composure notably absent as he addressed his employer. "Sir, there's a situation at the Rivera property," he reported, his gaze deliberately avoiding Maggie. "Peterson is requesting your immediate presence." The transformation was instant, August's features hardening into the mask of authority she'd glimpsed before. "We'll continue this discussion later," he told Maggie, already moving toward the door where Samuel waited with a tablet displaying what appeared to be security footage. "Mr. Carter," Maggie called after him, a sudden premonition making her stomach tight with concern. "Penny has art class today. She's been looking forward to it all week." August paused, conflict visible in the tense line of his shoulders, before he turned back to face her. "I'll be home for dinner," he promised, the words carrying more weight than their simple meaning should allow. "Tell her that." 2 hours later, as Maggie helped Penny mix watercolors for her landscape painting, the mansion's security system activated with a series of discreet but unmistakable clicks as doors automatically locked and shutters descended over vulnerable windows. Samuel appeared moments later, his calm demeanor firmly back in place despite the obvious lockdown procedures. "Miss Bennett, please take Penny to the safe room immediately," he instructed, his tone pleasant, but brooking no argument. "Mr. Carter's orders. There's been a threat against the family." Penny's paintbrush clattered to the table, her eyes wide with a fear that suggested this wasn't the first such threat she'd experienced. Without question, she gathered her stuffed otter and moved to Maggie's side, small fingers gripping Maggie's hand with surprising strength. The safe room, accessed through a concealed door in August's study, resembled a comfortable apartment rather than the bunker Maggie had expected, clearly designed for potentially extended stays with a small kitchen, bathroom, and separate sleeping areas. Most notably, the walls were lined with security monitors showing every approach to the property. "How long do we need to stay here?" Maggie asked Samuel as he verified the room's security systems, noting how Penny had immediately claimed a window seat in the corner, her body language reverting to the closed-off posture of their first days together. "Until Mr. Carter returns or gives the all clear," Samuel replied, pausing at the door before adding quietly, "The Rivera situation escalated. Rival family making a statement after the warehouse incident. They're testing boundaries since Penny came back into Mr. Carter's life." 8 hours in the safe room stretched Maggie's patience as she alternated between distracting Penny with board games and watching the security monitors for any sign of August's return. The girl had retreated into silence again, the progress of recent weeks seemingly erased by this new threat. "Your dad will be back soon," Maggie assured her, though doubt gnawed at her confidence with each passing hour. "He promised he'd be home for dinner, remember?" Penny's only response was to clutch her otter tighter, eyes fixed on the monitor showing the mansion's main entrance. The tension in her small body spoke volumes about previous promises broken, previous fears realized. Just past midnight, The security system chirped softly as the lockdown protocols disengaged. Moments later, the safe room door opened to reveal August, his usual impeccable appearance marred by a torn sleeve and what appeared to be dried blood on his collar. "Daddy!" Penny cried, the first word Maggie had heard her direct to her father as she launched herself across the room. August caught her with practiced ease, his expression momentarily unguarded as relief washed over his features. "I'm sorry I missed dinner, Princess," he murmured against her hair, eyes meeting Maggie's over Penny's head. There was a misunderstanding that needed to be cleared up. After settling Penny in her bed with promises of pancakes in the morning, August found Maggie in the kitchen, methodically wiping down already clean countertops. "Thank you for keeping her safe," he said, pouring himself 2 fingers of bourbon from a crystal decanter. "Is it over?" Maggie asked, setting aside pretenses of kitchen duty to face him directly. "This misunderstanding that put your daughter in a panic room for 8 hours?" August considered her for a long moment before answering, his usual calculated reserve slightly diminished by exhaustion. "For now," he admitted, rolling his shoulder with a barely concealed wince that caught Maggie's attention immediately. "You're hurt," she stated, nursing instincts overriding her frustration as she moved toward him. "Let me see." Before August could object, Samuel appeared in the doorway, his normally impassive expression tight with urgency. "Sir, we have a situation with Peterson. He's been compromised." The change in August was instantaneous, all trace of fatigue vanishing as his posture straightened and his eyes hardened. "Where?" he demanded, already moving toward the door. "The boathouse," Samuel answered, his gaze flicking briefly to Maggie before adding, "He says they know about Miss Bennet and her connection to Penny." For the first time since meeting him, Maggie saw raw fear flash across August's face before it was quickly masked by cold determination. "Lock down the east wing again," he ordered Samuel. "No one enters without my direct authorization." "August!" Maggie called after him, the use of his first name stopping him momentarily at the threshold. "What's happening?" He turned back, conflict evident in his expression before resolution settled in its place. "Someone inside my organization has been feeding information to the Mendoza family," he explained with brutal efficiency, "including details about you." "Is Dad in trouble?" she asked quietly as they sat at the breakfast table, pancakes going cold on their plates. "Is it because of me?" Before Maggie could formulate a reassuring response, the mansion's perimeter alarm blared through the house, followed immediately by shouted commands from security personnel. Within seconds, 2 guards burst into the kitchen, weapons drawn. "Miss Bennet, we need to move you and Miss Carter to the panic room now," one stated, his tone leaving no room for questions. "The south perimeter has been breached." 3 armed men escorted Maggie and Penny through the service corridors toward the study, moving with practiced efficiency until gunfire erupted from somewhere near the front entrance. The lead guard went down with a cry of pain, clutching his shoulder. "Run!" the second guard commanded, pushing Maggie and Penny forward as he turned to provide cover. "The study is 20 meters ahead. Get inside and lock the door." Maggie grabbed Penny's hand and sprinted down the corridor, the child keeping pace with surprising speed. Behind them, more gunshots echoed, followed by a heavy thud. They reached the study door just as heavy footsteps rounded the far corner, revealing 2 men in tactical gear with firearms raised. Maggie shoved Penny behind a heavy bookcase, seconds before the first shot splintered the doorframe beside her head. "Where is the child?" demanded one of the intruders, his accent thick with Caribbean inflection. "Carter's daughter. We know she's with you." Maggie's mind raced through options, none of them promising as the men advanced into the room. "She's not here," she lied, praying that Penny would remain silent in her hiding place. "August took her away last night." The taller intruder laughed, the sound devoid of humor as he gestured with his weapon. "You expect us to believe Carter would leave his precious daughter with the mansion under attack?" He scoffed, moving closer with predatory confidence. "Search the room," he ordered his companion, eyes never leaving Maggie. "The boss wants the girl unharmed, but he didn't specify about the nanny." Glass shattered, plunging the room into shadow broken only by dim light, filtering through the curtains. Maggie used the momentary distraction to lunge for the nearest intruder, slamming her full weight into his midsection and sending them both crashing into a side table. "Run, Penny!" she screamed, clawing at the man's face as he struggled to regain his balance. "The safe room. Now!" From her peripheral vision, Maggie saw Penny dart from behind the bookcase toward the hidden panel that concealed the safe room entrance. The second intruder shouted in triumph, pivoting to pursue her, Just as the study door burst open again, August Carter stood framed in the doorway, a pistol in each hand and fury etched into every line of his face. 2 rapid shots stopped the intruder pursuing Penny before he could take another step. "Daddy!" Penny cried, changing direction to run toward her father as Maggie continued struggling with the first attacker who had pinned her against the floor, his hands closing around her throat. Black spots danced in Maggie's vision as oxygen dwindled, her lungs burning for air that couldn't pass through her constricted windpipe. Through dimming consciousness, she registered August's voice commanding Penny to cover her eyes, followed by a sharp, loud sound that released the pressure on her throat instantly. "Maggie!" August's voice penetrated the ringing in her ears as gentle hands lifted her to sitting position. "Breathe. Just breathe. You're safe now." Air rushed painfully into her lungs as she coughed and gasped. August's arm supporting her back while his free hand kept Penny pressed against his side, her face still carefully turned away from the carnage in the room. "The others?" Maggie managed to rasp. "Neutralized," August answered grimly, helping her to her feet as Samuel appeared in the doorway, blood streaking one side of his usually immaculate suit. "The property is secure again. For now." Hours later, after the aftermath had been dealt with and Penny had finally fallen asleep under sedation from the family doctor, August found Maggie in the solarium, staring unseeing at the star-filled sky. "You saved her life today," he said quietly, settling into the chair beside her. "They came for her because of you," Maggie responded, no accusation in her tone, merely stating a fact that couldn't be denied. "Because of what you do." August was silent for a long moment before answering, his voice weighted with rare honesty. "Yes," he admitted, running a hand through hair disheveled from the day's events. "The Mendoza family thought taking Penny would force me to surrender territory in the port expansion. You're not just an importer," Maggie stated, turning to face him directly for the first time since he'd entered. "You control organized crime in half of New Orleans. I maintain order in a system that would exist with or without me," August corrected, his eyes holding hers steadily. "The Carters have overseen these territories for 3 generations. We prevent the chaos that comes from power vacuums and turf wars." Dawn broke over the Garden District with a summer storm that washed blood from the mansion's marble steps and masked the sound of police sirens in the distance. Maggie stood on the covered veranda, watching raindrops create ripples and puddles while contemplating the impossible decision before her. "Your scholarship paperwork is ready to submit," August said, appearing beside her with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "Tulane's nursing program would welcome you for the fall semester." Maggie accepted the coffee without comment, her throat still tender from yesterday's attack, her mind replaying the moment August had eliminated a threat, without hesitation, to protect his daughter, to protect her. "And Penny?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible above the rainfall. "She's asking for you," he replied, the simple statement carrying layers of meaning in the new reality they inhabited. "She wants to know if you're leaving because of what happened." A bitter laugh escaped Maggie's lips before she could stop it, the sound immediately triggering pain in her bruised throat. "What happened is that I witnessed multiple murders in a home invasion orchestrated by your business rivals," she said, voicing the surreal truth aloud for the first time. "And yet you're still here," August observed, his tone carefully neutral as he studied her profile. "Most people would have run at the first opportunity." Maggie turned to face him fully, seeing beyond the calculated control to the uncertainty beneath. A man accustomed to power, suddenly vulnerable in ways he couldn't control. "I stay because Penny needs stability, not because I condone what you do." August nodded slowly, accepting her terms without argument, in a display of restraint that surprised her. "I've made arrangements to move Penny to our property in the Cayman Islands until the situation with the Mendoza family is fully resolved," he said after a moment's pause. "You're leaving New Orleans?" Maggie asked, unexpected disappointment coloring her tone despite her determination to maintain emotional distance. "When?" "We're leaving," August corrected, emphasis subtle but unmistakable. "Tonight, if you choose to come with us." The invitation hung between them, weighted with implications that neither was prepared to voice aloud. "And if I don't?" Maggie asked, needing to understand exactly what choice she was making. "Then the scholarship stands, along with a security detail until the Mendoza situation is permanently resolved," August answered without hesitation. "Your safety isn't conditional on your decision to stay with us." She found the girl in her bedroom, methodically packing favorite books and toys under Samuel's watchful supervision. When Penny spotted Maggie in the doorway, she abandoned her task and ran across the room, wrapping thin arms around Maggie's waist with desperate strength. "You're not leaving, right?" Penny whispered, face pressed against Maggie's sweater. Dad said you might stay with your own family now. The innocence of the question struck Maggie's heart with painful precision. This child who had endured so much still worried about abandonment above all else. I don't have any family, Penny, she answered honestly, smoothing dark hair away from worried eyes. We could be your family, Penny offered with childish simplicity, unaware of the complexity her words unleashed in Maggie's mind. Dad smiles when you're around. He never used to smile after Mom left. 2 hours later, Maggie found August in his study, surrounded by documents being systematically fed into a shredder by Samuel. Both men looked up at her entrance, a silent communication passing between them before Samuel discreetly exited, closing the door behind him. I've made my decision, Maggie stated without preamble, hands steady at her sides despite the magnitude of the choice she was making. I'll come with you to the Cayman Islands, for Penny's sake. Relief flickered across August's face before his usual composure reasserted itself. Just for Penny? He asked, the question revealing more vulnerability than he'd likely intended. For now, Maggie answered honestly, maintaining the direct gaze that had characterized their interactions from the beginning. The rest, we'll have to see with time. August nodded, accepting her terms without pushing for more, a restraint that spoke volumes about his respect for her boundaries. There's something you should know before we leave, he said, retrieving a file from his desk drawer. About your parents. Maggie's breath caught as he placed the file in her hands, her name written across the top in official lettering she recognized from years of foster care documentation. What is this? She asked, fingers trembling slightly against the manila folder. The truth about the flood that killed them, August answered quietly. They didn't perish by accident, Maggie. They were targeted because your father refused to launder money for the Donovan family. The revelation hit Maggie like a physical blow. Memories of that terrible night suddenly cast in sinister new light. The late warning about rising waters, the mysteriously failing pumps in their neighborhood, the bodies found downstream rather than in their home. How long have you known this? Since I had you investigated after you helped Penny, August admitted, watching her reaction carefully. The Donovans were eliminated 5 years ago in a turf war with the Carters. My father made certain of it. Outside, the storm intensified, rain lashing against windows in sheets that mirrored Maggie's internal turbulence. So, in a way, she said slowly, processing the implications, your family avenged mine without ever knowing it. Sometimes justice finds its path through unexpected channels, August replied, moving closer but still maintaining a respectful distance. I can't change what I am, Maggie, but I can promise that you and Penny will always be protected, whatever you decide. As the private jet carried them over the Gulf of Mexico that night, Penny slept peacefully across 2 seats, her head resting in Maggie's lap, while August worked quietly opposite them. Lightning illuminated the clouds outside, brief flashes that revealed new landscapes in what had seemed only darkness moments before. Thank you all for following this story. If you're enjoying it, please write in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video, as your support is crucial for me to continue creating content here.